Now we're going to assemble with liquid nitrogen, and for this we first have to cool down the station. Be aware that we have to work in nitrogen vapor and not submerged on the liquid nitrogen, so we should not fill this tray all the way to the edge here. If we work submerged on the liquid nitrogen, the chances are higher that we build up too much pressure and most of the grids will be destroyed. So you have to work in vapor. And that means when we fill nitrogen, we have to fill only on the outside here. We shouldn't fill on the inside of the ring. Although in the beginning this is still warm, so most of the nitrogen will evaporate. Especially at the end, when this system gets cold, you have to be aware that you do not pour any nitrogen here in the center, but only nitrogen on the outside. So here we go, we're going to pour in liquid nitrogen. And you see that I'm pouring the nitrogen only on the outside. And here you want to stop. So you want to make sure that there's only nitrogen on the outside of this ring. And in the beginning it's okay to have some here in the center. It actually helps you to see when this is cold. Again, we have the Leidenfrost effect, that as long as this nitrogen bubbles here are dancing on this warm surface, we know that this block is not yet at the same temperature of liquid nitrogen. And then we can keep on adding nitrogen on the outside here. And you might do a little bit, a small splash on the inside. So this is a cutout that is made especially for that, so you can put some liquid nitrogen there. You can see that this disc is also at the right temperature. Be aware that all these parts will cool at a different rate. And what we're again looking for is this hissing sound and this sudden burst of vapor that is released from the system, showing that the temperature of the metal is equal to the temperature of the liquid nitrogen. As you can see, we still have here bubbling of nitrogen, so it's not yet cooled down. Adding a bit more. Especially now, only add nitrogen to the outside ring. So now you can slowly hear this hissing building up. So there it is. Okay, so that was the Leidenfrost effect. So that's the protective layer of vapor between the liquid nitrogen and the metal surface that escapes at once when the temperature reaches the Leidenfrost temperature. That means it's almost the same temperature as liquid nitrogen. And then all this protective gas layer or this vapor layer escapes at once, and that gives this heavy boiling. However, what you can still see, that heavy boiling, it's not boiling of actually the nitrogen, it's the Leidenfrost effect, but it looks like it's boiling, was indicative of the outside block. But as you can see, there is still a droplet of liquid nitrogen here dancing around. So be aware that this disc has not yet cooled down to liquid nitrogen temperatures. So you still have to wait until that happens. So due to the Leidenfrost effect and the escape of all this vapor at once, the level of the nitrogen has dropped down significantly down to here. So we have to refill it so that it's almost at the top. So you want the nitrogen level to be roughly here. And we're very careful, we can put a small drop of nitrogen on this disc and see if there's still some nitrogen dancing around, but it's not, so we know that this disc is now also cooled down. So now that we're at liquid nitrogen temperatures, we can start adding the components that we need. So first we're going to add the storage box, and again you cool it down on the outside in the liquid nitrogen until you see the Leidenfrost effect, and then we place it over here. So the next thing we add is our grids that come from the Vitrobot. So we have that in a storage vessel with some liquid nitrogen, and we have to move this from here to the assembly station. So you do this quickly, first coming from your storage box to the outside, and then from here you can place it in one of the slots. So you can unscrew the lid. However, be aware that it can often happen that grids will actually attach themselves, because this becomes sometimes statically charged, can attach themselves to the lid. So when you take the lid off, always then move it to the outside liquid nitrogen and check via the side if there is any grids hanging on. If you would take it out of the tray and you find out that your grids were actually stuck to the lid, then you have to go back and make new grids, and that would be a pity. So always make sure that you remember that these grids that are in their respective slots might stuck to the lid, and when you take the lid off, you can take them out. So make sure that when the lid is taken off, you don't move it outside this station, but you first put it in the liquid nitrogen, so that at least you can recover them if they're stuck to the box. The next step is that we're going to cool these tweezers down, so we place them here. We also have the autogrid tweezers now that we need to cool down. And again, we have to watch for the Leidenfrost effect. So you can see the tips of these tweezers bubbling, and then this hissing sounds. You can see the sudden whoosh, and then they're cooled down. So we're now ready to start assembling the grids. So now that we have the grids and everything in place, we come in with one of the rings. We could cool that one, but it's so small volume that these rings are almost instantly cooled to liquid nitrogen temperature. So we place that ring in the station. Then we can cool these tweezers down with the tip in liquid nitrogen, because now we're going to touch directly our prepared plunge frozen EM grids. So we're going to take one of these grids out and place them on the ring. And be aware, these grids can get stuck to your tweezers, they can jump around, they can move, but try to grab them as further to the edge as possible, because the more contact you have with these grids, the easier it is for them to get stuck to your tweezers and move around. So now that it's properly placed in position, we can take away these tweezers, and we can come with the autogrid tweezers, and we can center the ring, centering disc over our grid. Now we come with our pre-prepared insertion tool. So there is a C-clip on the outside ring. We could either cool these tools down in the outside vapor and wait, or the quicker approach when your grids are not that sensitive is to just dip them, only the tip, in liquid nitrogen and wait until you see again the Leidenfrost effect. The advantage of first dipping them into liquid nitrogen is that you can use the Leidenfrost effect to know that they're cold enough. If you only leave them in vapor, you don't know that. So you can also shortly dip them in a liquid until you see the Leidenfrost effect, and then place them for a short period of time here in vapor, so that that liquid can drip out again. But you just have to try. Some grids are more sensitive than others. So now we are putting the insertion tool on top, and we slowly click. This tool can go away. We can now turn the disk back, and we can take our autogrid assembly, our cartridge, out of the slot, place it in the storage box. There are people that want to do an additional step here, and it is when they grab the grid out, they place it here on the side and they flip it over like so. And the reason for doing so is that you can actually see if the grid is properly mounted. If the spring is not properly mounted and you would flip it over like so, the grid would come off. Now if you're certain of what you're doing, it's not necessary, but there are people that like to do that. And then you have one grid mounted. As you might see, the nitrogen level here goes down, so you want to fill that for a second run and keep the level as high as possible, because the higher you have that nitrogen level, the higher your nitrogen vapor level becomes, and everything that is in vapor is clean or mostly clean and cold. So the lower this nitrogen level becomes, the more chances you get that when you raise a grid too high, it might devitrify. What you also might notice now, that during recording of these movies, it takes more time to do so. You start to see that all these tweezers start to develop frost and ice on the side of these tweezers. Also this disc becomes white. So the longer you're working with this system, the more chances you have that there is ice crystals and contaminants coming into your system. Now here you're working in the vapor, so it's not that bad, but in the nitrogen surrounding it, you will get some ice crystals that could attach to your grid. So always make sure that you practice this when you start using it. Practice this dry for a couple of times so you get experience with it, and the more experience you have with the system, the faster you become. Of course, to prevent more contamination from coming in, you could always use the lid and work through the lid and doing the same procedure as we've demonstrated here. We're not using that here because we can then not clearly show it with the camera what actually needs to be done. Now the last step, when you have assembled all your grids, is that you have to take these grids to the autoloader cassette loading station, and for that we need to take the box out. So you then take the transparent lid and the tool to put the lids on the boxes. Then you first again cool it down, wait for the bubbling to stop. So now we know the temperature of the lid is at liquid nitrogen temperature, and we then turn and we put the lid on like so. Move it to the nitrogen again, and we can come with the storage nitrogen. So now we go from here into our storage doer. So we do there, and now we can move this grid to the loading station of the cassette.